There's a lot that can be said, and has been said, about Castlevania and the impact it's had on gaming as a whole. Popular even from its early days, and eventually becoming one of the namesakes of a whole genre, the Metroidvania, Castlevania's status as a cult classic is well earned. And they're good games. There's a reason so many great indie games like Hollow Knight and Blasphemous take their cues from the path that Castlevania helped to forge. But no one really gives much time of day to discuss the story. I mean, sure, there are endless jokes about Symphony of the Night's dialogue, but a lot of people brush the series and its millennium-spanning narrative off as just silly or minimal. I do think there is a reason for this. A lot of the strongest narratives within Castlevania, and the deeper themes in general, are told off-screen through implication and subtext, or retconned in by later entries. For example, Portrait of Ruin adds posthumous depth to the narrative of Bloodlines that was hardly there in Bloodlines itself, but makes John Morris and Eric Lecard two of my favorite characters in the series. Something similar happens with Richter Belmont, who I believe is one of the most important characters in the entire timeline. I think his narrative recontextualized the concept of being a Belmont entirely, and what it means to be a savior. This becomes a running theme in the series, but it's so subtextual that it becomes necessary to engage heavily to understand that the games have these themes to begin with, and so many people aren't willing to dig. That's kind of a problem with Castlevania narratively, but it also makes it really thrilling to analyze and pick apart with your friends. And it is necessary to understand that it has these problems because of the limit of hardware and video games at the time. The original Castlevania came out in 1986 on the Famicom, basically at the dawn of popular gaming. By the time we reach the last entries of the series on the Nintendo DS, the games have evolved to something incredibly rich and rewarding, both in terms of gameplay and narrative, seeing the series evolve from a pastiche of old Universal horror movies to something far greater than the sum of its parts. So, what is this subtext? Allow me to lead you through a theme-centric reading of the series, roughly in timeline order. Hopefully this should enrich your understanding of the series' narratives, but I think it's worth mentioning that these are only my readings, and I'd love to see your own analyses and how they may vary from mine. Castlevania's 1,000-year-long narrative is surprisingly easy to summarize in a few sentences. After losing their respective loved ones, an immortal vampire and a family of hunters called the Belmonts swear revenge and battle every 100 years, earning respect for their once exiled family, until one of their heirs is possessed by one of Dracula's minions, and attempts to revive him on his own, thus cutting off the Belmonts from their role as vampire hunters until their prophesied return to glory in 1999, when Julius Belmont ends Dracula for good. Dracula is then reincarnated in the modern day as Soma Cruz, who rejects the role of being Dark Lord and destroys the source of Dracula's power, thus ending the saga. It's seemingly simple, a rise and a fall and a rise again, grudges being put to rest, but the true joy I find in this narrative is that each game is its own self-contained story that is strong on its own, and each entry contributes to what the series is trying to say. Each theme thus has multiple facets and depths. For example, all the angles from which it explores the ideas of family, duty, agency, and fate. Castlevania is about legacies, cycles of trauma, and breaking those cycles. The battle between the Belmonts and Dracula is a cycle that repeats each century, and a cycle literally spawned by trauma and grief. The Lament of Innocence. Dracula, once a mortal named Matthias, only goes down this path of violence because of the grief of losing someone he cared about, his betrothed Elisabetha, to an illness. Thus, he sets in motion a scheme to acquire from another vampire lord the Crimson Stone, an alchemical relic that will grant him power over death. Leon, the first Belmont, is the other side of the same coin. Due to losing Sarah, he too swears revenge, and basically signs up his descendants for this cycle of trauma as well, even abandoning his wealth and status to do so. Sarah is turned into a vampire as a result of Matthias's machinations and is killed. She literally becomes Leon's weapon of destruction. The vampire becomes the vampire killer, the ancestral weapon of the Belmonts passed down throughout the years. She is literally weaponized grief. This is what Lament of Innocence is all about. Leon is doing this for the right reasons. Just letting Dracula destroy humanity would be wrong, obviously. But there's something compelling about how he and Dracula are the same in terms of motivation, and even former allies. The echoes of their trauma and Sarah's is felt throughout the entire series. It begins with these cycles being set in motion, and ends with them being broken after centuries of pain and generational trauma that only existed because of those cycles in the first place. The endless battle. The final battle of the first game in the timeline is not against Dracula, who's the final boss of every other game, but rather against Death. This ties into Leon's lack of closure and his motives for pursuing revenge, as well as alludes to the effect of death on the narrative and the way it haunts Leon and Matthias. Thus, the true battle begins here. Every iteration of the cycle is only building on what started it. Though Matthias becomes a vampire, Dracula himself, he doesn't actually begin his quest to destroy humanity until much later, after he takes a second wife, Lisa. Together they have a son named Adrian and live peacefully. Lisa is a healer of sorts, but she is in turn attacked by the same people who she sought to aid. She is attacked and crucified by a mob of humans, which Adrian witnesses. She tells her son her final wish: do not hate humans. If you cannot live with them, then at least do them no harm, for theirs is already a hard lot. Dracula did not take this to heart, immediately swearing to destroy all of humanity for taking what was precious to him. If he became a vampire to spite death itself, then this new revenge is his attempt to spite life. Adrian, horrified at his father's actions, chooses a new name, Alucard, the inversion of Dracula, since, it's Dracula backwards. I come back to this idea of cycles again, as Elisabetha and Lisa's deaths are also in some ways a cycle. Elisabetha and Lisa look nearly identical, and their deaths were both the catalyst to Dracula's descent. There's even a theory that they're involved in a reincarnation cycle, which also involves another character, Mina, but that's much later. Admittedly, I find this over-reliance on dead wives for man pain to be a pretty irksome one, and certainly a stain on a series I really love overall, but I think that this element gradually becomes less and less prevalent as the games go on. Order of Ecclesia, the last canonical entry in the series before Konami pulled the plug, so to speak, can even be read as a rebuke or deconstruction of the same trope, the sacrificial woman, one that Igarashi, the one behind most of this lore, relied heavily on. I think it's telling that he went from calling a female protagonist not fitting for the stories he wanted to tell to making a woman the star of his indie passion project Bloodstained. I'm willing to forgive him for that one. Somewhere between Alucard opposing his father and the events in the next chronological game, Castlevania 3: Dracula's Curse, he ends up being confined in a coffin in the castle's basement. Due to this new threat of Dracula, the church sends one of their clergymen, a witch disguised as a man, named Sypha Belnades, to apprehend this new threat, but she is stopped outside the castle by a cyclops, which turns her to stone. One of the townsfolk, the noble thief Brant Dynasty, attempts to start his own rebellion against the Count, but is subjected to the cruel fate of having been transformed into a monster. Only one hope remains: Leon's descendants, the Belmont clan. Before this, somewhere along the line, the Belmonts have also been exiled from the country of Wallachia. But as Dracula becomes more of a threat to the church, they tentatively ask them to return, and they send Trevor C. Belmont to handle the new threat. Yeah, you see what I mean about important stuff being off-screen? During the game, chronicling Trevor's attack on Dracula's magical castle, he rescues Sypha and Grant and allies with them as they raid the castle, and spars with Alucard and proves they're serious about overthrowing the Count. This ragtag group of adventurers are all outcasts: the exiled warrior, feared for his immense power, the witch who lives in disguise, the thief, the man who is neither vampire or a human. But together they're able to overcome Dracula's power, and the morning sun rises on Wallachia once more. This mirrors the theme of the Bram Stoker novel. They're only able to overcome this evil by working together and combining their knowledge and skills. Though the Belmonts will still struggle, they have gained back some respect and recognition, and their exile is no more. Sypha is finally comfortable enough to come out of hiding and come out as a woman. Grant goes on to help Wallachia rebuild its towns. Alucard, however, unable to cope with having killed his father and the idea of perpetuating his monstrous bloodline, plunges himself into a centuries-long sleep until he is eventually needed most. Dracula's Curse has an immediate sequel, Curse of Darkness, which I won't go too in-depth into, but it also concerns itself with these themes of grief and revenge. Hector, a former follower of Dracula, betrays him. However, he loses his lover to his former ally Isaac's schemes, and swears his own revenge, which gets both Devil Forge Masters lured into another plot to prematurely revive Dracula before a century could pass. Hector's story, revenge in response to revenge, Isaac inflicting grief after enduring his own after Hector's betrayal leads to Dracula's defeat, is a microcosm of this idea of cycles. What saves Hector from being used as fuel for Dracula's revival is that he refuses to let the curse, the cycle, take hold, and refuses to kill Isaac, thus redeeming himself, while Isaac has lost himself entirely. Hector, too, holds outcast status. For his participation in the dark arts, he is an outcast to humanity. Additionally, for his betrayal, he is an outcast to the monstrous, occupying a similar in-between status to Alucard, while also directly being a foil to Dracula. He lost his lover, Rosalie, in the exact same way that Dracula lost Lisa, but he fought to make sure he didn't lose himself. Dracula can't say the same, and thus the cycle repeats. These next few summaries will be a little more minimal, simply because these games are a lot more simplistic narratively, and to attempt to ascribe any more meaning than this would be less analysis and more projection. The next chronological entries, two pretty terrible games on the Game Boy, Castlevania the Adventure and Castlevania II Belmont's Revenge, I am going to mostly skip over, but I do think that Soleil, the protagonist's possessed son, is an interesting character if only because he reads like an early version of Richter, who, as I mentioned, is extremely important going forward. Possession, too, is itself a prevalent motif throughout Castlevania and almost embedded into the plot structure of later entries. Agency and manipulation, too, are thematically important, and Soleil is one of the first ever examples of this particular motif. Additionally, Dracula is only able to corrupt Soleil because Christopher failed to kill him before, as he faked his death and escaped, which I think is pretty interesting. After Christopher saves his son from Dracula's powers, which is the first shadow on the Belmont's legacy, the next heir to the vampire killer is Simon Belmont, the one who started it all in the original Castlevania game on the Famicom. Simon defeats Dracula like his forebears, but is left with a curse in Dracula's last moments, and this curse, leaving him with wounds that refuse to heal and numbering his days as he wastes away, forces him to relive his role in the cycle a second time, like Christopher. His second outing is Simon's Quest. Yes, the game where you get cursed by Dracula isn't called Dracula's Curse, I know, where, on a time limit, he seeks out Dracula's remains in order to destroy them and free himself before he dies. Dracula's remains, literally parts of his dead body, are an interesting bit of lore, as they are physical remnants of the previous incarnation of the cycle. They seem to be associated with granting wishes, though inconsistently, as seen in Harmony of Dissonance and Simon's Quest, but they most often appear as the instruments for Dracula's revival, often filling both roles in a single game. They're also a force of corruption and possession, as in Harmony of Dissonance and Order of Ecclesia. The remains of Dracula have a strange dual nature. What, then, are we to take from their first appearance in the series, where in trying to use them to grant his wish, Simon ends up using them inadvertently to revive Dracula, himself perpetuating the cycle? That Dracula's resurrection is often attributed to human greed and selfishness. What are we to make of Simon's attempt to cheat death? I acknowledge that Simon's Quest was made before Castlevania even really had lore, but this makes theorizing and coming up with wild readings pretty fun. You may argue, correctly, that there is no way these readings are intended by the creators of the text, but it's fun to speculate regardless. Anyway, after triumphing over Dracula the second time and saving himself from his impending doom, Simon has finally finished bringing the Belmont clan the respect that Trevor had only begun to earn a couple hundred years ago. And it is here that the heavy pressure of legacy begins to weigh down, and where the chronology gets more detailed in its storytelling, so expect longer analyses from here on out. Harmony of Dissonance turns its focus towards Juste Belmont, Simon's grandson, and of particular note is his prominent Belnades blood. It is unclear why Sypha's genes are more dominant here rather than in any of her other descendants, but he is effectively a bearer of two lineages, the magical Belnades clan and the well-respected and heroic Belmonts, especially his legendary grandfather. Juste was trained for this purpose from a young age in the village he grew up in, and had two close friends, Maxim and Lydie. Juste is entrusted with the vampire killer, thus dividing him and Maxim. To quote the game itself,
There is something I think you should know.
Go ahead, you can tell me anything.
The day you inherited the title of Vampire Hunter, I felt as if a wall had been erected between us, and for that reason I set out on my expedition. I wanted to be better than you, and relieve you of your fate. Long ago, you told me of Dracula's remains. Do you remember that?
Yes, I remember. The story of how my grandfather, Simon, gathered Dracula's remains and destroyed them to undo his curse.
I thought my wishes would be granted if I too could gather and destroy them.
Out of a desire to free his best friend from his fate, Maxim seeks out Dracula's remains. However, at the end of his search, he loses most of his memories of the time period, and Lydie has mysteriously been brought to the castle, surely Dracula's own. In actuality, the power of the remains split Maxim's mind into two parts, or layers, and from his mind came the castle, which is layered into two realities. In English, they're called Castle A and Castle B, but in Japanese, they're known as Omote and Ura. This is a concept in Japanese culture that refers to two faces. Omote is the mask you project to others, whereas Ura is your true, more private feelings, deeply buried. Dialogue supports this interpretation, as the Maxim you encounter in Ura Castle refers to himself as Maxim's repressed feelings. Similarly, the player begins the game under the impression that there is one castle, until its other side is revealed and they realize they were traversing both simultaneously, just like one realizes there are many sides to a person. I think it's a genius way to tie the narrative into the setting of the game itself. Personally, I think Maxim is in love with Juste. No, really, or at the very least he cares about him very deeply. His repressed feelings are what caused him to try and make a wish with the remains and do the impossible, become the bearer of the vampire killer, a weapon he could never use, all for the sake of his male best friend. And he is freed from the remains' corruption by Juste wearing the friendship bracelets that symbolize their bond, reuniting both halves of himself, finally cut off from Dracula's corrupting spirit. I mean, we LGBTs are pretty familiar with the idea of repressed feelings. It is by acknowledging the bond he has with Juste that he is saved from this repression. The worst ending is pretty telling, though. Both Maxim and Lydie die, unable to be saved from Maxim's unrestrained, angry, repressed emotions in the spirit of Dracula. All Juste can do is watch the castle crumble and lament that he's failed as a vampire hunter. The emphasis on failure is what intrigues me. Of course, given his legacy and upbringing, he'd fear it. However, that fear will weigh even harder upon his optimistic descendant, literally possessed by the fear of worthlessness outside of the context of the cycle. One has to wonder if this concept is Juste's own Ura, his hidden emotions. But it certainly is implied to be Richter's. Like all downward spirals, though, it starts at a high point for Richter Belmont, protagonist of Rondo of Blood. This game is his blaze of glory. He too has been raised with this idea of the importance of being a hero living up to his legacy, that all of humanity's fates rest on him. His chance to prove his heroism comes when Dracula is revived by the Dark Priest Shaft, and many are forcibly taken from his hometown, including Annette, his fiancée. The exact purpose of these kidnappings is unknown, but Dracula is seen making advances on Annette and offers to turn her into a vampire, which she refuses. I've always taken this to mean that Dracula was intended to have a human maiden as his bride, though I doubt this was intended to read as an attempt to replace Lisa, as this was before she was introduced into the canon of the series. After the kidnappings occur, a 12-year-old girl, Maria Renard, orphaned and from a family of other vampire hunters, attempts to invade the castle for revenge, similar to Richter, but is captured by Shaft shortly after entering the castle. Richter sets her free and the two become close allies. I interpret Maria as being a sort of medium between two extremes, which will become relevant in Rondo's sequel, Symphony of the Night, as her role in the story is kind of to convince Alucard not to kill Richter. Her and Richter strike up a sibling-like relationship, and they continue through the night freeing the other woman from the Count and his priest. I once again circle back to the scene of Annette rejecting Dracula's advances. What he offers is corrupting power and immortality, a place of authority at his side. Annette answers that she'd rather end her own life, which makes her an interesting contrast to her lover. Richter's arc is about a pursuit of power to make his memory immortal, as he believes that that is his only purpose. That Richter falls to this temptation and Annette does not is pretty interesting to me. The conclusion is that Richter's true happiness is not in endlessly fulfilling his purpose, but rather redefining himself and literally revoking it, like Annette. I have so much to say about Symphony of the Night it just bleeds over into Rondo, but I'll try and stay in topic. Additionally, when Richter rescues Annette, they have this conversation. Richter's vampire hunter blood is juxtaposed directly with his need to bleed a little. The idea that his legacy inflicts pain is subtly hinted here as he's being pulled towards his destined role, literally called by Dracula's blood. Annette is again a contrast. Despite what he needs to do, what he's been destined to do, she wants to pull him towards safety. Already we can see the main conflict of Richter's life at play, and it is reinforced after he defeats Dracula. The Count asks him, as he dies, if he has any desires, if he has any difference from the greed of humans, which revives him each century. Richter hesitates, stutters even. Igarashi, who is the brains behind Symphony of the Night, did not work on Rondo of Blood directly, but his girlfriend at the time did, and he often came over during lunch breaks to playtest it while he was busy with the development of Tokimeki Memorial, which he helped to write and direct. This influenced his decision to want to join on with the next Castlevania game, which I can't help but take interest in. I wonder what he saw in Richter that influenced the narrative that would eventually be told. Before he joined onto the development of Symphony of the Night, it was initially conceived of as a game called The Bloodletting for the Sega 32X, which Richter would have been the protagonist of in opposition to a mysterious rival character. We don't know much about this. One can only guess which elements ended up being repurposed and recontextualized in Symphony of the Night. So, I ask you this, what need for the shepherd when the wolves are all gone? After Dracula is defeated, and Shaft along with him, the dedicated priest concocts a new plan, one to eliminate every vampire hunter and have the Belmonts under the Count's thumb. He will take control of Richter, make him the lord of the castle, and have other vampire hunters come to duel him and die, as Belmonts are the strongest among all vampire hunters. If you've been paying attention, you may have noticed that Richter's repressed desires and how they lead to his possession seem to have a similar vibe to Maxim's. Richter's stated motivation while under Shaft's control is that Belmonts have but one chance to shine. He has been conditioned and trained to consider this opportunity his one paramount goal, his only purpose in life, and it's over. Now aimless, Shaft had the perfect opportunity to twist that doubt into something darker.
So it is you. But why is a Belmont planning the resurrection of Count Dracula?
Count Dracula rises but once every century, and my role is over. If I can resurrect him, then the battle will last for eternity.
If I resurrect him, the battle will last for eternity. In other words, he is trying to cope with his role within the cycle being over by perpetuating the cycle itself, even though it is the source of his pain, because it is, after all, the eternal battle. After Shaft takes control of his feelings, he disappears into the night, and his sister Maria, now 17, follows after him, unknowing of the darkness brewing within him. Of course, without any hunter able to oppose the Belmonts, his true opponent in this duel will indeed be a vampire, in an inversion of the hero-villain dynamic. The heroic vampire Alucard against the villainous vampire hunter Richter, as he is awoken by Richter's disruption of the balance. As an aside, I know the wording of possession, and the way Shaft literally controls Richter, does actually make for compelling evidence against these being Richter's true feelings. However, being corrupted by hidden emotions and turmoil is actually touched upon in later entries, see Harmony of Dissonance and the non-canon entry Circle of the Moon, and is actually more commonly used in the corruption plots than just straight up being puppeted around. There is still a robbing of agency, but more so taking away the choice of whether to act on these feelings or handle them more healthily. I also believe my reading of Richter's possession is supported by the dialogue in Rondo of Blood, as I explained before. Even before Shaft possessed him, the desires were there, and Shaft just takes him to his worst possible conclusion. The bad-ending speech from Alucard about how he chose a path of violence because it was all he ever knew also supports my reading.
Mankind continues to fight, but it is a desperate fight to stay alive. I suppose that he chose a life of warfare, since that was the only way he knew. Like you, Father, he chose a path of destruction. Farewell, land of my birth. Never again will these eyes gaze upon your beauty.
Inversion is a key theme in Symphony of the Night. Alucard himself is an inversion of Dracula, even in name. Richter perpetuating the cycle by inverting its roles and attempting to resurrect the Count also is an inversion. On this axis is placed the two castles, one a literal inversion of the other. And Alucard is an inversion of the typical Belmont heroes that the series was known for at the time. He is effeminate and floaty, a stark opposition to the heavy masculine frame of heroes like Simon and Trevor. Indeed, at the time of Symphony's release, Alucard was the first main protagonist that did not quite fit this mold apart from Eric Lecard, and even then, Eric shares his screen time with the brawny John Morris rather than being the main event. This ties into this idea of breaking cycles, that the end of the cyclical trauma comes with a new, different perspective. The gameplay is also the first Metroidvania in the series, bringing the game to a new audience rather than the hardcore gamers that classic Vanias were targeted at. Higurashi, now in his debut as the creative hand behind Castlevania's lore, is too a fresh perspective from what came before, and helped to evolve the series past its formula. The idea of a different perspective changing the outcome is also reinforced by Maria, who becomes Alucard's friend and convinces him that there's more to Richter than just pure evil, otherwise he would have simply killed him. It's a shift in status quo, and the Belmont is dethroned. Not through the violence of the eternal battle, but by a reflection of Lisa's last wish for Alucard. Do humans no harm? The good ending is accessed not by defeating Richter, but rather by setting him free from the control that has taken his agency and turned him into that which he had sworn to destroy. Her wish is extremely relevant to the narrative, as Alucard relives this moment in a nightmare, and eventually at the game's climax, he tells Dracula exactly why he's been troubling his mother's soul, that everything he's done since Lisa was killed goes against anything that she ever stood for. I see people point out a lot that Dracula, knowing this, her last wish, and begging for forgiveness, and yet continuing his reign of evil in subsequent games, is bad writing, and I honestly think there's something kind of intriguing about that. He cannot free himself from the cycle he's buried himself in until the end, the very end. His constant rebirth only to be killed violently once again in his own cycle of trauma. That's his cycle, and he can only cope by burying himself deeper and deeper rather than forgiving those who hurt him, until he becomes worse and worse. And every cycle ends when his own does. He is an inversion of Lisa, who died while forgiving. Like all traumas, the events of Symphony of the Night do not leave Richter unmarked, and this metaphorical tainting has severed his connection to the whip. If the vampire killer is the Belmont's weaponized grief, then there's something to be said about how Richter recognized the unhealthiness of the cycle separates him from that ancestral grief. The Belmonts are no longer its bearer. Alucard intends to repeat his actions and return to eternal slumber, but it's heavily implied that Maria pursues him and convinces him to change his mindset towards himself. The next time we see him, he is living among humans. Heroism in the era of Belmonts was a metaphorical sacrifice, becoming an outcast of the society you fight for and dedicating your whole life to a predetermined purpose. But in the era that follows, after the Belmonts disappear into obscurity, any pretense is stripped away. It is literally sacrifice. After the Belmonts all disappeared, they went to live in a remote village called Wygall, unknown to the outside world. What exactly happened to Richter after he gave up the vampire killer is unknown, but I like to think he got what he needed. The Belmonts we meet in this game, Order of Ecclesia, are living happy, normal lives, the sort of healthy environment that would have helped Richter. In the Belmonts' absence, those in power at the church panicked. Without the clan there to defend humanity, there would be no stopping Dracula the next century he returns from the grave. To find a solution, many organizations were started with the intent of discovering such a way to destroy the Count again. And in this time of confusion, one dedicated follower of Dracula, named Barlow, opted to take advantage of the situation. He began his own organization, Ecclesia, of which he was the absolute leader, and used funding he received from the church to create a system of magical spells called glyphs, and the ultimate glyph, Dominus, which would take the life of the one who used it, in exchange for a massive explosion of power, a sacrifice necessary to break the seal that held Dracula, and had been entrusted to Ecclesia by the church. It was created from Dracula's remains out of the desire to grant his own wish, what he believed was also the subconscious wish of all mankind. If humanity's greed itself was what caused Dracula's resurrections, and he continued to be reborn, then humanity must be inherently beings of greed and selfishness. Dominus needed that sacrifice, that vessel, and for that purpose Barlow raised children to be conditioned. The two that received the focus of the narrative here are the stoic and serious Shanoa, as I mentioned, and Albus, her adoptive brother, a strong-willed scientific magic researcher. Barlow raises them to respect his authority within their isolated cult, and to dedicate themselves entirely to the mission of being the saviors to humanity and the potential bearers of Dominus, believing that they will defeat Dracula rather than resurrect him. They are sold the same narrative that the church was. Regardless, Barlow chose Shanoa, his greatest warrior, as the bearer of Dominus. Albus, however, discovered Dominus's true price through his scientific research, and taking his role as her older brother seriously, begged to take her place and be the bearer, to save humanity and the person he loved most. Barlow initially agrees, but sends Albus on a fool's errand to buy time and perform the rite with Shanoa as the vessel to Dominus. Albus, however, returns prematurely on a hunch, a correct one. He interrupts the ceremony and steals Dominus in the nick of time, but not nearly quick enough to save Shanoa from having been, essentially, hollowed out. She is left without her emotions and memories, and Albus runs away with the Dominus glyphs, and she's safe for now. His plan has a problem, though. He can't absorb Dominus. However, he is dedicated to doing the impossible. From a young age, both Shanoa and Albus have had agency in their lives stripped away, essentially lambs raised for slaughter. Any opportunity Albus had to make a decision for himself and to give Shanoa freedom from this is shut down by Barlow's authority and control. He reacts to his trauma by trying to wrestle out of this control, whereas Shanoa sinks deeper into it. There's a through line of dehumanization and objectification. Shanoa insists she will become Dominus. Barlow considers her a vessel and a means to an end, and Shanoa's own catchphrase, "I am the blade to banish all evil," directly compares herself to a weapon, an object. And Dominus itself is the name of God in Latin prayers, but it also means master, the same title Barlow demands his followers call him, thus enforcing his own authority over his weapons. Shanoa is a vessel to his beliefs. After Shanoa recovers from the aftermath of the ritual, she is sent to track down Albus and retrieve Dominus. What ensues is a chase through the Romanian countryside, while he stalls for time and eventually perfects what he once could not do. He absorbs Dominus and makes himself a vessel, hoping to use the remains to grant his own wish to protect Shanoa from death. His attempt goes wrong, or maybe that's always what Dominus was going to do to its bearer, as if you'll recall, Shanoa's own acceptance of the glyph was pretty horribly botched. Anyway, Dracula possesses his body, and after reporting back to Barlow on this turn of events, Shanoa is given the order to kill. And she does. Albus is murdered by the person he loved most, killed by the blade. This happens in both the good and bad endings. The player has no agency in this choice. If there's any criticism I see most of Order of Ecclesia's story, it's one question. Why didn't Albus tell Shanoa that Dominus would kill her? But I think this is actually pretty consistent with his character. Shanoa even comments that he's always tried to solve problems on his own without telling her, near the end of the game when she's regained her memories, so clearly this is a habit. And I also think this ties into the idea of agency. Albus has just learned that his has always been stripped from him. He is a scientist, and his experiments are things of control. There's something he can have agency over, so he absorbs himself in his work. He wants these to be his actions, his choices independently, even if he's still trying to fulfill the purpose he had been conditioned for. Even after abandoning Ecclesia, he wanted to make himself the martyr for their cause. And in his quest for agency over his and his sister's fate, desperate for control after losing everything he ever knew, he ends up only more viscerally and literally controlled, made a vessel to Dracula's spirit. And I think, ironically, even though he does deeply care for Shanoa and genuinely loves her, his plan also removed her own choice. His neglecting to inform her of the true situation out of his own pride and desire to be in control of his life does not allow for her to have her own control over this choice. Even if I do think his motivations are entirely good at heart, I don't think he's a bad person at all, but he's definitely a messy, traumatized person acting on pure emotion in response to the abuse he faced. The opposite of Shanoa's descent into apathy. When Shanoa and Albus fight, it is only a battle of puppets controlled by the same master. Even Shanoa's design reflects her lack of agency, arms bound in ribbons and her back exposed, hinting at Barlow's metaphorical backstabbing. Either way, Dracula wins in the end of the Battle of his own pawns, and Albus always dies no matter what the player does, similar to the agency being stripped away from these characters. But what Dracula did not account for was the Weigall villagers. The disappeared Belmonts living quietly in that secluded village. Albus was actually able to do what no one else could, track down their living descendants. He becomes convinced that he can use their blood to control the corrupting powers of Dominus made from Dracula's remains, and grant his wish to become the vessel. This doesn't work, of course, but in the process of collecting their blood, he leaves them all within a stasis spell called Torpor. Shanoa, asked to rescue them by Nikolai, the founder of Weigall, lets herself be distracted from the orders Barlow gave her, and absorbing the glyphs that trapped each one also absorbs some of their essence or spirit. Though she is emotionless and struggles to relate to people, Shanoa still makes the choice of her own accord to rescue, talk with, and help the villagers. Inserting yourself into the roles of the cycle won't save you, but developing as a person will. That is what I think the blood versus essence dichotomy means within this broader reading of the series. And I love Weigall. It's my username for a reason. There's some really good quests there. And I think the villagers are very fun and charming. As an aside, I talk more about a specific villager and how her own narrative and Shanoa's intersect in an essay I wrote on my AO3 that I'll link in the description. You'll like it if you're curious about the lesbian subtext present in the game and the way Shanoa's emotionlessness ties into her arc. Anyway, the essence of the Belmont spirits allows Albus's soul to live on within Dominus, which Shanoa absorbed after slaying him, when otherwise he would have been destroyed. But metaphorically, it's socializing with people outside of her bubble that opens Shanoa's mind to his viewpoint rather than believing what Barlow had convinced her of. If Shanoa did not absorb the Torpor glyphs or rescue all the villagers, then the player gets the bad ending where she is coerced into using Dominus and dies. Dracula is then revived. If Albus gets through to her, she refuses to use Dominus, since he makes Shanoa promise to not sacrifice herself. And she finally confronts Barlow for using her. He had used her amnesia to obscure the trust and bond between the siblings, and to more easily manipulate her, and had deliberately brought on this amnesia and emotionless state, sacrificing those parts of herself to make her empty for Dominus. She fights for her agency, and Barlow is defeated. However, in his last moments, he opts to die to fulfill his own wish, revealing that his intent was always to revive Dracula. He lays his body on Dracula's seal and dies, reviving the Count. Shanoa storms the castle, braving various obstacles, and challenges Dracula. She's unable to defeat him on her own, though, and is forced to break her promise to Albus. She uses Dominus. This sets free her trapped emotions and memories, but she knows she will die. This time, she at least wasn't coerced into using it. This means that both endings of the game involve using Dominus, but one is without agency and one is a choice of her own free will. Albus' spirit, though, still trapped within the glyph as well, allows his soul to be taken in her place, allowing her to live on after a final farewell. I think it's worth mentioning that Shinoa is not passive or waiting to be saved by Albus. Albus never even knew about the whole truth of Barlow's desires, and Shinoa endangering herself by choosing of her own free will to storm the castle was her decision. And I do think it's especially notable that the choice that ends the game's story is to make a choice that he, too, was explicitly against, out of a genuine drive to protect humanity and the world that had welcomed her. I think overall, Order of Ecclesia is one of the most blatant games in the series about what it's trying to say. A lot of what is deep subtext in other games is explicit text here, and it informs how I read the others. As such, narratively, I think it is one of the most important. It's a lens. It's also my favorite game in the series, in case you couldn't tell by how long the summary of it is. Gameplay-wise, it's sort of a hybrid between the tough combat-focused linearity of a classic Vania and the exploration and RPG mechanics of a Metroidvania, joining both halves of the series for the final game released in the canon timeline in 2008. However, the idea of a Metroidvania as a fresh perspective also exists here, as when Shinoa breaks free of Barlow's manipulation and approaches the castle, the linearity is wholly abandoned for a more traditional Metroidvania map. Similarly, it occupies a dual nature within the theme of cycles. The Belmonts are free of the cycle, and yet the cycle always demands a martyr that must suffer for their heroism. And Barlow's name, an English word for Bear Hill, is sort of an interesting play on Belmont, which means beautiful mountain, thus reflecting the corruption of heroism and innocence. And the game itself, Order of Ecclesia, refers to the Latin word for church, Ecclesia, but Ecclesiastes is also the name of a book in the Old Testament, considering the futility and cyclical nature of life.
What has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun.
Once Shinoa is free of Barlow's manipulation, only acting out of her own desires, she compares herself to the morning sun, a reference to Simon's quest, sure, but indicative of something deeper. Like Hector before her, who resisted falling into his own mini-cycle, Shinoa leaves no descendants and lets the story of Ecclesia be left forgotten, rather than leaving an ensnaring legacy. She has suffered much, discovering her life as a lie, losing everyone who was close to her, her home, and everything she ever knew. But there is light at the end of the tunnel, an escape. Though Albus' soul has faded from being, she can finally be happy, and she has closure. She has people who care about her, both Albus and the villagers, and her role is over. She's not alone. She can finally smile. You might be wondering, after all of that, what happened to the vampire killer after being split from the Belmonts? Well, don't fret, it was entrusted to Quincy Morris. You know, Quincy Morris, the Texan cowboy from Dracula by Bram Stoker, who died at the end of the novel to kill Dracula and save Mina from vampirism? Well, I don't blame you if you don't, since he's excluded from nearly every adaptation of the novel. He gets his justice in Castlevania, though, being very important to the lore. Already, you probably noticed the connection to this era's theme of sacrifice and martyrdom. What you need to know is that in Castlevania's timeline, Quincy used the vampire killer, which, not recognizing the Morrises as true heirs to the whip, sapped away at his life force and killed him. Though the exact reasoning for why it does this is unknown, and the nature of his death is not discovered until later, the whip is passed down to his young son, John Morris, during the events of the aptly named Castlevania Bloodlines. The vampire killer, during the post-Belmont era, as well as Dominus, both fill similar purposes within their respective narratives. They are the ultimate weapons that can destroy the Count, but require an equivalent sacrifice. One is holy and derived from light, the other is the dark power of Dracula himself. As the games that emphasized the roles of these weapons, Portrait of Ruin and Order of Ecclesia, were made back-to-back and on the same handheld, I wonder if the parallel, as well as other parallels between their narratives, were intentional. In addition to the vampire killer, Alucard had also created a spear to complement its powers, called the Alucard Spear, that he entrusted to another family, the Lacards. The Lacards are capable of magic and able to help the Morrises unlock the whip's unrestrained power. The best friend and ally of John, Eric Lacard, was once engaged to a woman named Gwendolyn, who was tragically turned into a vampire by Elizabeth Bathory, but mistranslated. She's named after the real-life Blood Countess. Seeing his loved ones get turned into vampires is sadly going to be a running pattern for Eric in the future. In the chaos of the First World War, Elizabeth seeks to resurrect Dracula, like most other villains in the series. In her case, Dracula is her uncle, so I guess it's a bit more understandable. Either way, John and Eric pursue her as she travels across Europe, similar to the last act of Bram Stoker's novel, motivated by their duties as the new heirs of these sacred weapons, but also by Eric's need for justice for Gwendolyn. They prevail against her and halt Dracula's premature resurrection, and eventually settle down and have families. John has a son named Jonathan, and Eric has two twin daughters named Stella and Loretta. John trains Jonathan to be a hunter, but notably, he refuses to let Jonathan learn how to use the vampire killer, right up until it claims his own life, which Jonathan deeply resents him for. No father wants to teach his son how to die, though. His grief mixes with anger, but ultimately John was trying to save him from the cycle that literally took his own father and killed him too, possibly because he figured out how exactly Quincy died. Eric, sadly, was powerless to interfere in his best friend's fate. Elsewhere, grief twists another heart into anger. A vampiric artist named Bronner's two daughters were killed in the First World War, and as the Second World War comes in full swing, Dracula's castle is revived by all the hate and suffering inflicted by the most evil people humanity has to offer. Though I'd argue Portrait of Ruin itself is much more about the aftermath of the First World War than it is about the Second World War itself. Bronner takes control of the castle with his magical portraits, each a reflection of his own psyche, which functions as game levels. He lures Eric and his twin daughters to the castle, believing Stella and Loretta to be the reincarnations of his own daughters. He kills Eric and bites the two girls, making them believe that he was always their father, as they are turned into vampires. Even with his family reunited, Bronner is still filled with anguish and begins channeling his turmoil into a final painting with which he can end the world. Forced to have watched his daughters turn into creatures of the night, Eric's ghost haunts the halls of the castle, taking on the name Wind. It is then that Jonathan Morris, his useless vampire killer, and his best friend Charlotte Alden, a relative of the Belnades, arrive at the castle. Igarashi himself has stated in an interview that the main focus of Portrait of Ruin is family, an extension of a theme already quite present in the rest of the series. But I would argue that grief, and putting it to rest, is just as prevalent. Wind, Jonathan, and Bronner are all tied to this conflict by their unresolved sorrow, just as much as the vampire killer is. If the vampire killer is weaponized grief, then it's telling that only after Jonathan overcomes his unhealthy coping mechanisms that he can truly use it. Charlotte is the brains to Jonathan's brawn. Charlotte yearns to be considered mature, but arguably so does Jonathan, desperate to step into the shoes of his late father despite not knowing what that truly means. While Charlotte is cocky, she's also level-headed compared to her childhood friend Jonathan, who's more impulsive and feels incapable of discussing his feelings, shutting down and getting angry in response to triggers. Despite this, Charlotte gets treated as immature far more often, which she hates. It's kind of interesting to see how gender plays into this narrative, considering this game came out not very long after Igarashi retconned legends due to its female protagonist. Charlotte, despite being extremely capable, is underestimated until she is finally able to use her magical knowledge to do what was thought impossible, curing vampirism. Jonathan's inability to discuss his trauma and emotions while trying to step into the role of a strong father figure evokes attempts to hold himself to the standard of toxic masculinity. It's only by abandoning this and having a long discussion with a literal ghost from his past that he can overcome this. As an aside, I think gender in Castlevania could be a topic all on its own. There's a lot to talk about. Anyway, once the two enter the castle, they meet with Wind and learn that Bronner, not Dracula, is the current lord of the castle, and after diving into one of the portraits, encounter his vampire daughters. The portraits themselves are stated to be an embodiment of the artist's will, and there are 4 of them: City of Haze, a Victorian-era town, Sandy Grave, an Egyptian pyramid, Nation of Fools, a destroyed circus, and Forest of Doom, a witch's academy, and each of them have a remixed version that the player must overcome near the end of the game. There's not much difference between the original and the remixes, so I'll stick to my analyses of the original portraits. City of Haze, in my opinion, is supposed to evoke a grander past. The town itself is filled with cake shops, baked goods, an underground train station, and so on, and is a picturesque vision of an English town during that time period. This is the same time period and location in which Bram Stoker's Dracula takes place, and Stoker's juxtaposition between the grandeur of England and the seeming superstitious and backwards nature of Eastern Europe and his xenophobia could make for its own video, but I'm getting off topic from Castlevania again. In this case, Victorian England represents a sort of calm before the storm, life before Bronner's life was turned upside down by his loss. The boss of the area, Dullahan, in Irish folklore is said to be an omen of death when it stops riding. The train tracks evoke the tube stations that would eventually be used as air raid shelters during the Second World War. Even the soundtrack Victorian Fear alludes to this foreboding, and the name, City of Haze, evokes the pollution and smog of London, a toxin ready to take hold. Is it any coincidence, then, that the next portrait is of grandeur left in ruin? The Sandy Grave is where the player first encounters Bronner himself. I consider Sandy Grave to be kind of an odd one out, as it's harder to describe a specific meaning to it, but I do find it interesting that Bronner mentions here that humans are set on spoiling the natural world, considering that Egyptian tombs were often grave robbed and excavated around this time period. If City of Haze is the past, perhaps Sandy Grave is its destruction, and its soundtrack is called Hail to the Past. Admittedly, this is the portrait I have analyzed the least, but its depiction of a massive dedicated grave does kind of indicate at, the honor that he has ascribed to the death of his loved ones. Nation of Fools is the most loaded with symbolism. The scene of destruction, frozen in time and gravity, evokes a bombing, and the boss, Legion, reused from Symphony of the Night, is a massive cluster of bodies. Nation of Fools is the cost of war, a chaotic playground when world powers treat human lives as playthings that took away that which he loved most. At the end, you find a cog, which is needed to progress forward, perhaps symbolizing the progress of industry at the cost of human life. The Forest of Doom, the last portrait, is another slight non sequitur, but I think its status as a boarding school for witches makes me wonder if Bronner's daughters were away at boarding school when they were killed. It's maybe a bit of an out there theory, and I see a lot of analysis seem to focus on the Nation of Fools as the site of their death, but the forest's association with youth certainly connects it to the daughters in my mind. If we take student witches as evoking the children he had who could never grow old, it adds a sort of significance to one of Bronner's opponents being an adolescent witch on the cusp of maturity. With his daughters dead, they become an ideal for Bronner to project onto Stella and Loretta, claiming to give them a good life while essentially hypnotizing them into loving him and forgetting about their lives as mortals. As Jonathan and Charlotte pose a threat to the sanctity of their family, Stella attempts to stop them prematurely, though she was ordered by Bronner to stay out of the direct conflict out of concern. Though she was stopped, she dropped what was perhaps their last reminder of Eric during her escape, a locket depicting the twins alongside their real father. It is then when Eric reveals his true identity and is able to discuss what happened with Jonathan, and Jonathan is able to learn and acknowledge the truth behind his father's death, and refusal to train him to use the whip. Eric, though, is haunted by his failure while being a haunting himself. He's refused to reveal himself to his daughters, not wanting to burden them with the knowledge of his death, while also being unable to handle the idea of seeing them as their current corrupted selves. There may still be time to cure their vampirism, but he dismisses it as impossible, resigned to his grief. If the player returns to the Sandy Grave, returning to that ruined past, with a late game ability, however, they can find the spell that Charlotte can use to free the twins. Eric's status as a ghost is as much without agency as his daughters are, as he is literally unable to act and merely is stuck watching the people he loves die, just like Gwendolyn and just like John. Charlotte makes for an interesting parallel to him, her partnership to Jonathan being an easy comparison to Eric's partnership to John. Charlotte has the awareness and drive to protect the people she cares about where Eric did not, left as a powerless bystander, and then she's the one to free Stella and Loretta from their hypnotic curse as well as their vampiric transformation. She succeeds in her role where he failed.
Eric, we lifted the curse from your daughters.
Thanks to my magical genius.
You were in time? I don't believe it. It's a miracle. They said they won't ask about you until all this is over. That's good. If they knew what I've become, it would only upset them. Now you can unlock the true power of the vampire killer.
That's what they said.
I'll give it a try if I feel like it. Well then, now that you know how John felt, perhaps that will be enough.
After saving Stella and Loretta, the Lecard twins are able to complete and give closure to Jonathan's relationship to his weapon, performing a ritual that allows him to battle the whip's memory, a reconstruction of Richter Belmont. It is only by defeating the memories of the past, of the whip itself and the trauma of the Belmont legacy, that Jonathan is able to become a true Morris hunter. It is notable that he is the third and last Morris to face Dracula, and the only one who, as far as we know, is not killed by his own weapon, as well as was aware of the risk of accepting the vampire killer's power, in parallel to his own resolution of his emotional arc. There can easily be a parallel drawn between his choice to use the vampire killer, even knowing the risks, and Shanoa's breaking of her promise at the end of Order of Ecclesia, and the idea of agency and personal choice. This strengthens the parallels between the two weapons as light and dark equivalents. Either way, Jonathan has broken his own emotional cycle and reached closure. Without Charlotte's healing power, this would have been impossible, mirroring her emotional support to him and his emotional support to her. Together, they are able to defeat Bronner and destroy his painting that could have ended the world. However, this frees Dracula from the seals placed upon his castle, and Death, Dracula's faithful servant, who had been working behind the scenes to try and wrest back control for his master, finishes off Bronner before he can ever get a chance to take what Jonathan learned to heart.
I don't care. Being a family means being connected by heart. Ties of blood and soul are insignificant. When I learned why my father did what he did, I understood. You used a curse to manipulate your dear daughters. Now that's sad.
With Dracula revived, the two friends ascend the staircase to the throne room to face their final challenge. I honestly used to think that Dracula's role in the plot is kinda tacked on at the end, and the story would be just as strong without him, but while writing this essay I realized this is not the case. He is deeply connected to this main theme of grief. Like Bronner, he is unable to escape from it. This is pretty unsubtly hinted at. His throne room is covered with depictions of Lisa, for example, these stone carvings, including one where her face is slashed out. In her arms is a young child, representing Alucard. This represents Dracula's ideal of his perfect family, shattered by grief just like Bronner's. It is likely not a coincidence that the slashed stone engraving is positioned next to one of death. Similarly, in the boss room, the ceiling has stained glass depictions of Lisa, as well as the skeletal memento mori. It is his grief that caused every cycle that converges here. Dracula even often taunts his opponents with the knowledge that his cycle will repeat, and he will return anew. So engraved he is in this idea of cyclical trauma. Portrait of Ruin's narrative consistently sets up foils to his mindset. When Dracula battles Jonathan and Charlotte, he is accompanied by Death, simultaneously representing this game's emphasis on teamwork and unique two-character mechanic, as well as the way that death and loss hovers over the whole narrative. In the final battle's second phase, he merges with death itself, stealing its soul, but together our heroes overcome. As the castle crumbles, Eric is finally able to say farewell to his daughters and finds closure, fading in the morning sunlight similar to Albus's death at the end of Order of Ecclesia, further pairing these games as parallel in my mind. Portrait of Ruin is in many ways a coming-of-age story. Charlotte, Jonathan, Stella, and Loretta are all on the cusp of adulthood. Charlotte wishes for maturity and respect, eventually proving herself, and Jonathan and the Cards all move on from the ghosts of their past and grow into a new phase of their lives. Stella herself mentions the need to take responsibility after all the events that have transpired, while Loretta expresses a drive to become stronger. Even still, there is an emphasis on not overdoing your role. Do not fail where the Belmonts did before you. Don't run yourself ragged and die like your ancestors. Don't force yourself to take on more than you can handle. And most importantly, live for all you're worth. After the Morrises, an old prophecy is set to be fulfilled. Nostradamus' prophecy, that the King of Terror will return during the eclipse of August 1999. And that the Belmont of that era will once more for a final time be called to face the Count and end the eternal battle. This Belmont is Julius, and he is aided by Shinto practitioners, a family called the Hakubas, who have their own shrine. As prophesied, they help seal the castle and the whip within the eclipse, sealing it in time and cutting off Dracula from his power source, a being called Chaos that appears to have the Crimson Stone at its center. This allows Julius, when he defeats Dracula, to finally put him in his grave for good. However, he pays the price, though when he escapes with his life, he loses his memories. This is not an ending of the cycle, and curiously, this climactic battle has never been shown in a game of its own, only alluded to in the lore of Aria and Dawn of Sorrow. Igarashi has said he had plans to make a game concerning the Demon Castle War, but he cut ties with Konami before that could ever manifest. Personally, I'd love to one day see a game about this battle, but I don't have my hopes up. As I said, the Battle of 1999 does not end the cycle. How could it? Even though things have drastically changed since when the Belmonts were last active, trying to end the cycle through yet another iteration of its rules could never work. Ending violence with violence only leads to more violence. Only through reconciliation will Dracula's soul be put to rest. And thus he is reborn as Japanese high schooler Soma Cruz during the eclipse of August 2017. It's worth noting that the eclipses of 1999, 2017, and 2035 are all part of one eclipse cycle, further alluding to this theme. This idea of reconciliation is also tied to the eclipse. In Japanese myth, an eclipse was caused by Amaterasu, the sun goddess, when she had an argument with Susanoo. Amaterasu hid in a cave called Ama no Iwado, thus hiding away the sun. When she is lured out, Susanoo has calmed down and the conflict is happily over. To quote the very, very mistranslated dialogue from Soma's best friend, Mina Hakuba, "Soma, do you know the story of Ama no Iwado Shrine? In the story, Tensho Daijin hides herself in the shrine to calm Susanoo down. Tensho Daijin is the sun. The act of hiding symbolizes an eclipse. By hiding herself away, she was able to contain Susanoo's anger. Yes, people have prayed to eclipses for centuries, and the Hakuba Shrine is the shrine for this very purpose." The game directly draws this parallel and associates the eclipse with the resolution of conflict and abandonment of past anger. This sets the stage for the eclipse of 2035, which Soma and Mina plan to go see together, unaware of Soma's connection to Dracula or even Dracula's existence at all. However, as the eclipse begins, they black out and awaken within the castle, frozen in time. It's there that we meet Alucard once more, now using the human alias Genya Adikado. Though Soma doesn't know it, Adikado is aware of Soma's role in the cycle, and the potential that he may continue where Dracula left off. He's been watching Soma for some time, and frequently visits Mina's family shrine. He attempts to explain the situation to Soma, but he is cut off from a sudden attack by the monsters that call the castle their home, now reawakened. This causes another reawakening, the power of dominance, or the ability of Dracula to control the souls of his monsters. Soma, having fought them off, gained dominance over a soul, thus kickstarting his journey to his inheritance. Soma's relation to Matthias is an interesting one, as their designs intentionally parallel each other. Lament and Aria were in development at the same time. They have the same fur ruff around their neck and even the same facial features. The beginning and the end, both designed around the idea of Dracula's humanity. Matthias' descent into darkness is represented by his black hair and dark clothing, as opposed to Soma being clad in white, representing the strength and goodness within him. Mina then is the parallel to Elisabetta and Lisa. In manuals, Soma is explained to be intimidating, and Mina is his only close friend. As such, she is his emotional support. However, as part of the family that contributed to Dracula's final defeat during the Demon Castle War, she also subtly hints at just how much of a betrayal Dracula's actions were to the memory of those he loved. Is it any wonder that she is commonly theorized to be their reincarnation, in a parallel with Soma being Dracula's? Adikado explains to him that he must reach the throne room in order for him and Mina to escape being trapped in the castle, and Soma goes on to explore the place and potentially discover the origins of his mysterious new power. Mina stays behind to give him hints and talk when he needs that aforementioned emotional support. Along the way, he meets a handful of friendly faces, like the shopkeeper Hammer and the witch Yoko Belnades, a close friend of Adikado and a descendant of Sypha from Dracula's curse. However, he also meets the manipulative missionary Graham Jones and the mysterious Jay, who is Julius Belmont after having lost his memory. Graham has come to the castle believing himself to be the reincarnation of Dracula after having been born on the eclipse of 1999, and that the one who reaches the throne room is the one who will inherit his power, which he believes should be in the right hands. His hands. Graham lures Soma in with his nice words, but once he learns Soma is the true inheritor of the power of dominance, he betrays him and stabs Yoko, who had been trying to convince Soma that Graham was really an evil person. All the while, Julius's memories are returning, and he starts to realize that Soma may be the eternal enemy he had been destined to defeat just as much as they are beginning to become friends. Soma's friends, Mina, Hammer, Yoko, Julius, and even Adikado, often sending hints to him while remaining in the shadows, each of them have ties to those who opposed Dracula in previous iterations of the cycle. They act as his emotional support as he realizes his role in all this. As he battles Graham in the throne room, metaphorically proves his dominance over Graham and awakens his true identity as the Dark Lord. Graham dies, and Adikado comes to meet with Soma, who doesn't want to become the new Dark Lord, as he is good at heart. In a moment between father and son, Adikado tells Soma to traverse through the castle to find a chaotic realm, which houses the being Chaos, as I mentioned before. Rather than merely sealing himself away from it, Soma must destroy that part of himself entirely, wholly abandoning the cycle. This is essentially Dracula freeing himself from his own trauma. However, before he's able to reach the chaotic realm, Jay, now knowing that he is the legendary Belmont, challenges him to a battle. Since he is Dracula's reincarnation, he can't allow his eternal enemy to go free, nearly falling back into his role in the cycle. However, in their battle, recreating the eternal battle, they both subtly reject their destined roles and inheritance. Soma is battling to progress forward and end the cycle, not perpetuate it, and Julius, despite everything, spares Dracula's life. He holds back. They end the fight peacefully, and Julius wishes Soma luck going forward. Soma asks that if he loses himself in the battle, Julius should end his life. Julius agrees and they part on good terms. When Soma faces chaos in the heart of the chaotic realm, he hears the voices of every friend he's made throughout the castle, cheering him onwards. Hammer, Yoko, Adikado, Julius, and Mina. They're all granting him strength for what lies ahead, and with that strength in his heart, he is able to destroy chaos. Chaos's first form is a circle, revolving in a cycle mimicking the cyclical nature of the key conflict. The heart of Chaos's second form, however, resembles the Crimson Stone, as I mentioned before. It also resembles an eclipse, but when it is destroyed, it is shattered like the shell of an egg, symbolizing rebirth. Dracula is reborn as Soma, the Belmont's duties are over, and Alucard is no longer bound to the awful legacy of his father. His mother is at peace. The vampire killer itself, even after centuries and centuries, is finally put to rest. Hello, Soma. Congratulations. I've got another job that I must attend to, so I have to go now. When I heard that you were Dracula, I was shocked. I was also just waking up, you know. If you think about it, though, everything turned out okay. I'll never forget your strength and courage. And I haven't thanked you yet for rescuing me, so thanks. You're like a younger brother to me. It was fun. I hope we meet again. Goodbye.
Hey there, much obliged for your business at my shop. Back at the castle, I realized my true calling. Fighting's not for me. I think I'll quit the army and open up a shop sometime soon. Promise me you'll come. I'll give you a good deal. You fought well. When we fled the castle, I felt the power from Vampire Killer fading away. I don't know what that means, but I won't have to do anything for the time being. Farewell. May we meet again. The path you took was the most challenging one. You did well. For God to be good, evil is an absolute necessity in this world. In the future, someone may follow again in Dracula's dark footsteps. At that time, perhaps we'll meet again. Farewell. In my mother's name, I send my thanks to you.
Wake up! Wake up! Soma wakes outside the castle at Mina's side, and he is free. Throughout this section, I have been emphasizing the role of Soma's friends as emotional support. This is not merely subtext, but rather addressed by the text itself.
I couldn't have won the last battle by myself. Everyone's kind words and encouragement led me to victory.
Dracula never had the emotional means to overcome his grief, but Soma did, and that is what gave him strength. Reconciliation is what broke the cycle. If you are familiar with the Castlevania series, you may be confused as to why I ended it with Aria of Sorrow and left out Dawn of Sorrow, its direct sequel. I honestly think that what it has to say is mostly the same as what Aria already pretty strongly established, and I also think that Aria is the perfect ending thematically to the entire series. Not that I hate Dawn or anything, far from it. I think some of its story more strongly supports the themes present in Aria, as well as the connection between Mina and Lisa. But I think that's kind of redundant. I've already said what I wanted to. Still, I think the final conversation between Soma and Adikado, father and son and father, is worth putting here as a sort of coda.
What Celia told you wasn't necessarily wrong. The Dark Lord is the entity opposite to God. Then that means there will always be a need for a Dark Lord, all because I ducked out from becoming the next in line. Don't misconstrue me. Perhaps there is a need for the Dark Lord, but there is no reason at all for you to become the Dark Lord. But if it weren't for me, none of this would have happened. You're neither a god nor a demon. You're only human. You have no chance at ever achieving perfection. Or are you saying you want to be the Dark Lord? No, of course not. Then stay true to that.
Whether or not the world summons another Dark Lord, if a cycle starts anew, this fun is over forever. And it could only end once Dracula could forgive humanity and become a human himself. I hope you've enjoyed this video. The world and story of Castlevania mean a lot to me, and I've made so many friends because of our love of the series and its characters. Though they all combine together into a single, shockingly cohesive narrative, each game shines on its own as a standalone story. And if you haven't played them before, I strongly encourage you to check them out. I think Symphony of the Night and Aria of Sorrow are pretty good beginner games, but Order of Ecclesia is hands down my favorite. I have love in my heart for every part of the series, though. This video was, above all else, a love letter. Thank you, and good night.